afternoon. Welcome to the first of the last two plenaries of Anthropocene Campus Melbourne, which is put on by a whole range of organisations, including the Deakin Science and Society Network at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation. I'm Emma Koval. I'm the convener of the Science and Society Network. I am just here to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the clans of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. This is going to be a very exciting afternoon, and I'm just going to hand over to Eben to introduce Patricia and Claudia.
Imagine a giant balloon, pink, glistening, billowing up over our heads. It's like a womb or a tumor. This is what was up over the entrance of Curious Affection, Patricia Piccinini's biggest show to date, which was recently in Brisbane in a museum called GOMA. Imagine walking into a dark room where there's a field of 3,000 white, fleshy stalks. Underneath, the floor is spongy. As you walk, the stalks start to move in response to your footsteps. There's fleshy, bulbous organs swaying on the stems. A pair of human legs is marching nearby, one foot firmly planted in the earth, the other kicked up towards the sky. There's a small humanoid creature, big, curious eyes like a marsupial, a tiny penis, long brown wisps of body hair. Maybe this creature is a pollinator. It's reaching up into a hairy orifice between those two legs that are marching. It's a groin of sorts. All around this world created by Patricia has a proliferation of surprising forms of life. So I had the privilege of walking through Curious Affection with Patricia and also with Claudia Vickers. So Professor Vickers is a synthetic biologist who's building novel biological parts and devices. Claudia is also director of CSIRO's Synthetic Biology Future Science Platform. She heads a research group at the University of Queensland that aims at engineering microbes for the production of pharmaceuticals, fragrances, agricultural chemicals, and biofuels. And perhaps more than anyone in Australia, Claudia has some of the tools and technicians at her disposal that are starting to bring elements from futures imagined by people like Patricia into contact with reality. So we're going to start off with a couple of questions. Later on, everyone here will have the opportunity to join the conversation. We've got a pair of microphones that we'll start passing around later. And I'm going to open up with a question to Patricia. And somewhere up there, we're going to have pictures, I believe. So my first question is about a piece that was in Curious Affection called The Couple. It's a pair of hairy monsters with long claws, and they're tenderly cuddling in the back of an RV trailer. These creatures seem to be the products of scientific enterprise, but they also appear to be living outside of human control, in a place that is a little bit wild. There's sort of an apocalyptic landscape in the background. So with some of these images in mind, Patricia, I was wondering if you could just tell us, in the context of your work, what might we say about the future of biological science and the wild forms of life that are starting to emerge in laboratories?
Okay.
Microphone.
Well, we're just walking through the show to The Couple, so we'll get there in a minute, I'm sorry. So what might we say? Well, I'm a visual artist and I make these works as a kind of conversation point, a sort of catalyst for us to discuss the stuff that happens in the real world. So I guess in some ways, I'm interested in science because science has come to be the way we understand the world, more so than any other way. And it can also be a way of depicting what we want the world to be. And also it can be what we fear the world might become. So with my work, I'm doing neither of those things. I'm not trying to depict things that I want to be created and I imagine should be here, and this is what's going to happen. I'm not doing that. And I'm also not creating ideas that are kind of cautionary tales and, if we don't watch it, this is what's going to happen. And my work's been used in both those contexts, often. But what I think I'm doing is I'm sort of at the place, which is a very exciting place, which I imagine a lot of scientists are at, is where the world might be. What are the opportunities that science is presenting to us? And what's the potential for that? And I don't have the answers. Lots of people ask me, "Do you, is this what you think is going to happen?" I said, "I don't know. I'm not a soothsayer. I'm not even an expert at anything. But what I am is someone who's really interested in our community, and I want to talk about these very complex situations. And what I present isn't even always good. It's not even ethically good, and it's a place where emotions and empathy and honesty collide, and that isn't always exactly what we might expect from the world or what we might want. And I often ask the question, if this is what we get from scientists, how will we respond? Will we love the failures of science as well as we will rejoice in the successes? But you asked about the couple, and this was a very special work for me because I've worked a lot with all kinds of relationships, often maternal relationships. And I made this work because I was very interested in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And, I've always been interested in that book since I read it 26 years ago. And one of the things that happens in that book is that the monster asks Frankenstein for a mate, and he says, "Oh, look, you don't love me. At least make me a partner that can be as, interestingly, he says, as reviled as me, so we will always be together," which I think is a bit. It's difficult. That's not even a great reason to want a partner, to be an outsider with someone else that can't escape from you. But anyway, this is complex. And the doctor, Frankenstein, says, "Yes, I'll do it." And then when he's almost finished, the monster's there, and Frankenstein looks up at him and he tears this woman apart. It's the most violent scene in the whole book. And there's a lot of violence in this book, a lot of killing. And I just thought, oh, that's interesting. Why is this the most... from this point, there's just no going back. Everybody is... There's no redemption, there's no coming together, there's no understanding, it's over. There's just destruction. And that always stuck with me. And I just thought, what would it be like if the creature had a partner? What would it be like if this creature had a chance to live a life where they're honoured and loved and cared for? And in fact, in this work, there's another thing that is interesting for me. It depicts a male who is allowed to rest. allowed to rest on a female's, his partner's, in this case, shoulder, and she is the one who's vigilant. And to present this in a kind of popular culture way, because that's what I do. I deal with ordinary folk. I'm a museum artist. I deal with people who, families, all kinds of people who come in, very sophisticated people, but we're not. It's the bubble's not the little bubble that I usually work in my studio, and the books we read and so on. It's like a big space, and just to have this depiction of a man kind of resting in a kind of almost vulnerable state is not done. Like there isn't another image like this in popular culture, and I think that's an issue. But I can do that. I can do this in art, and sort of it can enter the public's imagination.
So in that same room, I remember some other creatures. There were the gazelle mints and the tire lions. And Claudia, I remember we had a conversation as we were walking through this room. There's sort of, cracked concrete, lightning off in the distance. Could you talk about some of these improbable combinations, seemingly improbable, of fleshy matter, plastics, all sorts of strange polymers that you see on some of Patricia's work? Like, how does that relate to what's happening in the lab right now?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that, but I'd like if I could first bounce a little off what Patricia's just been saying, and also to recount my experiences of walking with you through this amazing exhibition, because I started to think about what was possible and how we would do these things using the science and the tools that we have, and the current capabilities and what we need to do to make that possible. But I also thought as I was walking, this is my reaction to what was there, which was, okay, how could we do that? Was my very personal, visceral reaction because I'm a scientist. But there will be lots of people coming through this exhibition who have many, many different reactions. And of course, there'll be people on the other end of the spectrum. So I'm unsurprised to find that the art is used in many, many different ways, and people react to science the same way as well. There's a whole range and often a strong dichotomy between the way that people react to the same science in society. And so I think there are a lot of parallels whenever you're creating something, and you're creating something. Mary Shelley created Frankenstein's monster, and the narrative that comes from that is very applicable to art and science at the same time, I think. So in response to the question about how this could be possible, I did start to think about this, and as synthetic biologists we take our inspiration from nature all the time. Everything that we do is inspired by nature. So if we're doing things that are what we call orthologous or sit alongside nature, we're almost always using the rules and the approaches and the techniques and evolutionary processes that are found in nature, exploiting our knowledge and our understanding of that. And one of the themes of my own research and of many synthetic biologists' research is that we often use these tools and techniques to understand things about biology that we don't fully understand. And we say, well, if we can create biology that behaves in the way that we expect it to behave, then we demonstrate that we actually do understand the rules behind what governs that biology and what governs that growth and that development. And so when I think of the tire lion creatures and the sort of post-apocalyptic environment there, that to me is quite visceral, because I believe that climate change is an anthropogenic thing and that we need to be very scared of it, and I look at that and think, well, this is maybe not so far from what could happen as a result of human beings' activities on our planet. But then I look at this little tire creature and I think, well, if I was trying to protect myself from some terrible UV rays that were coming in as a result of damaged ozone layers and such forth, that'd be a great way to do it. I mean, sun cream isn't going to cut it, right? And if we look at latex, right, and if we look at car tyres, they come from the same sort of biological polymer or repeating of units in biology. And the original latexes, they come from the latex tree, Hevea brasiliensis, the rubber tree. And we can use those genes to make latex-like and rubber-like compounds. And in fact, that's one of the things that we do in my lab. And so if you wanted a creature to be able to produce such a compound in an appropriate place and at the appropriate time, we could indeed control the expression of those genes. We could take those genes from the tree, if we found them, and insert them into the genome of a lion-like creature and ask those genes to express themselves in such a way that they would perform a protective barrier or locate around the neck and for this lion-like creature for whatever the purpose that would be is. And so that's how we'd create a creature that did that sort of a thing.
One of my favorite pieces of yours, Patricia, is an older one. It's The Bodyguard, part of your Nature's Little Helpers series, and it's got these big teeth. And when you first look at it, it's maybe a little confronting, and people think it's does that bite? And I show it often in undergrad lectures, trying to ask the students to identify what it is. And sometimes people think it's a monkey, or it might pig-like humanoid creature. So I guess the teeth of it are meant to bite the gum tree. So the hee-ho, the helmeted honeyeater, an endangered bird here in Victoria, can drink the sap of this tree because its companion species, a kind of possum, is also in decline. So I've heard you talk about it as a genetically engineered creature, maybe brought to Earth by aliens to save a particular kind of life. And there's a way that in some ways our technologies have, and I think this is the general Anthropocene discourse, right? Our technologies have become so powerful that they've endangered all sorts of things. So this one bird is an example of a creature. Yeah, there it is in the background. You get a faraway picture of the bodyguard. When you see it up close, it's got these big fangs. It's intense, but I love it. So Donna Haraway, in writing about your work, talks about the generational duty that scientists might have towards their failures as well as their accomplishments. So before we were talking a little bit about, there's specific elements of science, and those get taken up in various ways and get capitalized and extended all over the place. So how might we do that work of intergenerational care for the failures as well as celebrate how the world has shifted in consequential ways when an emergent technology disrupts the world?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're all really good questions, and they're the questions that obsess me, especially coming from a place like Australia where we've had a long history of trying to intervene with very good intentions. And I asked myself the question, if I could create new life, if I was a scientist and could create new life, what would be the reason that I would do it for? And my reason would be to help endangered species survive, because I'm really worried about mass extinctions. And so I looked around a few years ago and I didn't have to look very far. In my own state, our state bird, the golden helmeted honeyeater, which is a beautiful bird, is endangered. I think there were 28 individuals left. And I thought, how can I protect this bird? I know I'll create a bodyguard for it. And so I made this bodyguard because I thought that this bodyguard could help it against other predators, but also mainly because it's got a symbiotic relationship with a possum, and this possum is dying out, and because we're encroaching on its territory, and the possums create holes in the trees, hollows, and it has nowhere to roost. And so what this bodyguard could do was also protect it from us. That's what he would be protecting the bird from. He would protecting the bird from, and and also at the same time be able to create hollows in the tree. Now, this sounds like an incredibly convoluted story, doesn't it? Like, come on, it's intense, right? Like creating a bodyguard for a bird. But sometimes I sort of think, well, we do that. We're sort of doing that in the real world anyway. When we introduced the cane toad, and now it's a nightmare. But we had good intentions. We introduced rabbits and foxes for very good reasons, to make this environment seem more palatable and familiar to us. And now they've come back to really threaten the environment. So, I'm interested in why we would change nature. What's a reason that we should change nature? And I'm asking those questions in my work. I don't have the answer. I don't, and I think every situation is different. I was talking a few minutes ago. My husband and I went up to the reef, and I was amazed to learn that 2/3 of it is gone. The size of Japan, this reef is. It has an amazing biodiversity, 300 species of coral. Generally, reefs have 30. It's an amazing place, and the managers that have looked after this reef have had the idea, it's natural, can't touch it, and it's worked. It's really, they've really looked after it. But now global warming has meant that the very fragile relationship the polyps have with their algae that photosynthesizes the light and feeds the polyp, it breaks, and they're expelled, and the bleaching happens, and then it dies off. And so the question is, do we change our ideas of what nature is? And do we try and come up with some amazing solution to try and introduce a new algae that would change? It wouldn't be natural, it would be artificial. Is this a good enough reason to change nature? And these are big questions. And I would love it if scientists could step in and say, we've got an algae that can work with the polyps, is not so affected by rising water temperatures. I'd be so happy. I wouldn't care if it was artificial or not. But that wouldn't conform to the contemporary idea of what natural and good is and right is. So I think these are questions that are vital for us to talk about. And I hope that my work does its bit to kind of engage with that very, very loaded place.
So moments ago we were talking about these intergenerational practices of care and responsibility. CSIRO is in the process of, talking about making models of gene drive, and with the aim of eradicating feral cats. Highly controversial. You have people like Bob Brown out in front saying, we introduced the cane toads, but will gene drive be any different? I was wondering if you could just explain what gene drive is, and talk about, in addition to the feral cats, what other uses of gene drive are currently being debated in Australia.
Yeah, I'd love to, and I'm going to segue into that because we are looking at using gene drive for some environmental applications. But I'll give you a bit of a broader picture first. So the Synthetic Biology Future Science Platform, which is the CSIRO program that I run, works in 3 different application domains, we call them. So these are areas that we deliver science solutions in. So one of them is called chemicals and fibres, and this is the space where we work with things like producing rubbers and jet fuels and flavours and fragrances using environmentally friendly, sustainable processes that can replace petrochemicals. And people are generally pretty comfortable with this because the process that we use is contained in vats of brewing vats, basically, the same sort of way that we make beer. And, you know, if there's an accident and it breaks, well, there's a bund around it that stops it from escaping, and it's contained and it's felt, you know, to be fairly safe. The second one is health and medicine, and historically there's quite a high uptake of advanced biotechnologies in the health and medicine space. So if you can cure a child of leukemia using gene editing, which is sometimes yes, sometimes no, considered synthetic biology, then people are quite comfortable with that. And there are many, many applications of synthetic biology and advanced genetic technology. So the insulin that 20% of the people in the room will be taking at some stage in their life, probably more, is made using a genetic modification process. And then there's environment and biocontrol. And this is a space that is highly controversial, because the technologies that we develop will be released into the environment. Should they be approved? Should they be successful? Should they go through all these processes that you would have to go through to approve them? And this is the space that has us, you know, it is most often in the newspapers, and that people challenge us, rightly so, to talk about it and ask us about, because technologies that go into the environment like that, they're intergenerational, and whatever we do here could have a very significant effect on not just human beings, but of course their entire environment and biology, and ultimately biosphere-atmosphere interactions and the whole globe. And so this is a space that is very important, it's very controversial. And you run up against these questions of, yes, you know, there are all these things that we've brought into these environments. There are the cane toads, there are the foxes, the cats, the mice, and they've done terrible things ecologically to Australia. And Australia is an amazing, amazing country. It's an enormous island, and we have very, very strong biosecurity and biocontrol for our enormous island, because it is actually one of the more pristine environments that we have on the planet because of its isolation. So that's really important to protect and to conserve. So there are many examples of failed biocontrols, but there are some examples of successful biocontrols. So, for example, the Cactoblastis moth, which was brought in to control the cactus, which was taking over enormous swaths of Australia. It's incredibly successful as a biocontrol agent. And then there were failures like the cane toad, which was brought in to control the cane grub. Cane toads were completely uninterested in that. They ate everything else they could get their hands on and destroyed whole ecologies, and then they're marching across the continent of Australia, and the ones at the front have longer back legs than the ones at the back, and moving, literally, you know, taking over our beautiful continent, which is a terrible thing. So nature is amazing, okay? And your bodyguard, I think, is a beautiful, beautiful example. We see things like that in nature all the time. We call them trophic interactions. So one example is when a leaf is being nibbled at by a herbivore, that leaf will often be able to release a volatile signal, and that signal calls a bodyguard. It calls an arthropod, or a wasp, to attack the caterpillar, and they lay their eggs inside this caterpillar, kind of this weirdo vampiric sort of a thing, and the caterpillar has forced to incubate the eggs of the wasp, and it destroys the caterpillar and saves the plant. These things happen in nature. They're amazing things, and it's not impossible that we could understand it well enough to engineer something like that. The approaches that we're looking at the moment are indeed using gene drive, and we're using them to look at invasive species like cats, mice, and ultimately foxes and things like that. Now, what is gene drive? Gene drive is something that almost defies our understanding of Darwinian evolution. So a gene drive is a gene that is forced through a population. This happens naturally as well, by the way. It's a gene that is forced through the population and may not have beneficial effects. So normally for a gene or a specific characteristics that's encoded by a gene to exist and persist in a population and to grow in frequency in that population so that it becomes dominant, it needs to have a beneficial effect, and there needs to be a selective pressure on it. So evolution needs to have a pressure that is gives the organism an advantage over the others around it so that the gene frequency increases and increases. A gene drive, the frequency of that gene will increase even if there isn't a positive selective pressure on it. And there are genetic ways that we can use to control this. And we saw it in nature first. So it was seen in nature first, just like CRISPR Cas9 gene editing was seen in nature. And then it was modified so that we could use it for our own purposes. So gene drive is a way of proliferating a gene in nature, even if it doesn't have positive effects. And you can engineer it in such a way that it ultimately has negative effects. So you can use a gene drive to proliferate through a population and then initiate its negative effects and actually use that to force a population to extinction. This is about as controversial, I think, as you can get in genetic modification and genetic engineering, right? And these are the sorts of approaches that are needed or that we're looking at to try to control invasive pests that we have no other solutions for. Now, at the moment, we're not actually developing the technology, we're doing risk assessment on it. So we're looking at population modelling, at ecological modelling. We're trying to understand the biology so that we can identify the genes that might be useful for these sorts of things. And we're looking at social and ethical issues around that. We're looking at regulatory processes. So we're actually not even at the stage of developing the gene drives themselves that might do that, but we're trying to understand all of the broader things around that. And we're doing it in parallel. So we have quite a large social science program that looks at the social, ethical, legal, the regulatory, the political aspects that are all sitting around the sorts of technologies, more broadly, disruptive technologies that are being developed, as well as the technical side of things. So gene drives are a really interesting and really powerful technology. There are many different ways that they can be implemented, and they're one of the few technologies that we have, or in some cases maybe the only technology, to control these devastatingly damaging invasive pests. But we're looking at it holistically.
So I think I can anticipate a number of questions from the audience. I think Tim and Tao, who are in the back, have microphones. Before I turn it over to y'all, I've got one more question for Patricia. Do you want to respond before I ask my phone? Yeah, okay, great.
I'm just really absolutely getting off on all of this. I'm thinking, wow, that would be so great. If we could find ways to make life for the planet as we know it doable. But one of the things I think that I'm interested in as well is thinking about, when we change nature, should it be just for our sake? And what about, and in my work, I think I'm asking the question, I'm looking at the assumptions we make, things like, the world should be sustainable because we needed to keep giving back to us. And that's something that's an assumption that people make, and that maybe that's kind of superseded. You can't keep giving back to us. We have to nurture it back without expecting anything from it. And maybe it can't give us unlimited crops, and maybe it can't keep sort of evolving for us, so our life is better. And I think when I make these works, and we interfere with other animals for our benefit, to make our crops more sustainable, so we can feed starving millions. And I think what I'm also doing is I'm thinking, well, it's a wonderful thing to create life, but then that life has to be valued on its own, for its own sake, not just for what they give to us. So with this work, the young family, here we have a mother who is being bred just for replacement organs. And when we look at her, we can see how tired she is, and how sentient she is, and how she's thinking about her children, what's going to come of them. And it's difficult because if my son needed a new liver, I'd be the first one to cut her up. But then again, at the same time, I'm thinking, well, actually, that's not a great thing to do, because she has her own way of being, and perhaps we could see that in her, and that's what this work is trying to do. Use empathy to say, I'm a mother. I have my own love for my own children, and and that's valuable. And if we are going to go forward, then we have to. Not we don't have to, but it would be great to value other ways of being, even at the expense of ours.
So I've got one follow-up directly on that. So
Yeah.
this piece has a face.
Yes.
There's a certain empathy, like me looking into your eyes. Like I recognize you as a similar kind of life as me, and I sort of get that with this piece as well. The boot flower, which is next door at testing grounds, has a very different kind of face. And I'm actually going to read a quote from Karen, if I might, to help us think about the boot flower, which is right next door. So Karen Barad suggests a human ethics is not good enough when the face of the other, in quotes, has no eyes or is otherwise unrecognizable in human terms. Barad calls for a post-human ethics, an ethics of worlding. So the boot flower's face, which is part of the show that's next door, Mothers, Others, and Future Humans, it has a face, but it's very, very different from ours. It looks a little bit like a flower, maybe a little bit like a vulva. There's a tongue that's got a lot of hair on it. And I'm wondering, in the context of this piece, which might or might not show up on the screen behind us, you can really see it next door if you want to have a face-to-face encounter. So I'm wondering how we might reconfigure responsibility with forms of life that have already emerged in laboratories while looking into the eye, not the eyes, but sort of the fleshy ears and the sensory apparatus. When I get close to the boot flower, I feel like these almost ear-like structures are reaching out towards me. So what does that tell us about responsibility towards forms of life that have already emerged, as well as how might we reconfigure an ethics with an orientation to the future to come?
Well, my relationship to science is that it's just a given. It's not good or bad, it's just how we use it. And we're quite lucky to be here, to be honest. And what I get from science is that bodies are not particularly specific or even kind of finite. This is what I get from science. And what's happening in science is that you can bring things together. You can commingle them. And that's what I do in my world. I've been swishing you through my world, I'm sorry. But everything in my world is commingled. Everything is blended. And this is what happens in this boot flower. Everything is just coming together. So this boot flower, it's kind of a bit human. It's a bit like a plant, and it's got a kind of boot in it. So it's got an object as part of it. I didn't get this idea. This comes from science. This comes from medicine. I didn't dream it up. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, if you can imagine this sort of thing, like you couldn't, I don't think my dad could have imagined this because he grew up with animals and this technology wasn't around. But I can, and my children will be able to imagine other things. And I bring this work to the public, and people look at it, and some people hate it. Some people think it's disgusting and an aberration and something that we should fear. And other people think, oh, that's really interesting. This is actually very joyful and sanguine. And other people look at it and think it's actually a real reflection of what it's like to be here today. And actually, how can we continue to invest in these barriers that we put up between ourselves and other categories? Like this plant over here, we can do whatever we want with that plant. Because it's not human, these categories. Maybe we should give that plant personhood. We now know through science that plants communicate and they do all kinds of things. They engage bodyguards. Like, they have amazing ways of being in the world. Maybe they need our attention and actually love and treat them with respect. And so when I make these things, I don't do them to shock people. I do them because I just think it's kind of a celebration of life at a time when life is really threatened, but it's no life in particular. And that to me is a kind of way of going forward.
So I'm going to open it up now. I don't know how to do this, but if the lights could go up, I don't know if there's a magic way to make that happen. But maybe as people are gathering their thoughts, as microphones are starting to circulate, I can't really see hands because it's kind of dark out there. If anyone has a question right away, go for it. Or I'll let Claudia respond if you want to say anything to what Patricia's just said.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to the idea that we all have this sort of personal anthropocentrism, I guess, I don't know if that's a word, where things that are more relevant to us seem more important. You know, our children are more important. When I looked at the beautiful creature who was feeding her babies before I read the little blurb about that, I went, oh, that reminds me of me when I was breastfeeding my children. I was tired like that too. And then I went, yeah, and I'd be even more tired if I was hanging around waiting for someone to harvest my liver. That would be very challenging, right? So I think we place importance on individual things depending on where our value sets are. But there are cultures, and they're often Indigenous cultures, I believe, that place a much broader importance. So if they see if they look into a scene and they say, oh, yep, there's a koala in a tree, and we would say, oh, the koala is the most important thing in that environment because it's fuzzy and warm and reminds us of us, and it's our national emblem. And another person who is looking at that scene will go, well, that rock over there is just as important as that koala. That's part of that ecology and part of that environment. And even though it's not living the way that we see it, right, it doesn't have DNA and breathe and sort of seem a little bit like us, it's just as important because it's fulfilling some role. Maybe we don't understand what that role is, but it's fulfilling a really important role. And all different parts of ecology should really be seen that way, not in the human context, not as we ascribe value to it, but in just the importance of existing and the importance of being. And of course, it's easier to do that for something that lives and breathes, and easier still if it's warm-blooded and furry and, it seems a bit like us and has eyes and a face and all that sort of stuff. So.
It might be slightly tangential, but I'm just thinking that a lot of our problems come from our sense that scale is important and bigger is always better. And does that kind of touch into how we can approach our problems? So maybe if we can bring things back to a more individual or human scale, we might find better results.
Well, I think that's what I'm doing. I'm connecting to individuals on a very empathetic level. Like when I put art's a very personal thing. So you go to an art gallery and you're already entering into a kind of meditative space almost, a space of ideas, and you come to it with all your history and culture, and you engage with an artwork. And the meaning of the artwork resides not in me, Patricia, and not even in the object. It's in the interaction between all three of us, and there's meaning, and hopefully there'll be a moment where you could have a kind of a transformation of how you are in the world, and like sometimes that happens. I think with my work, not all the time. In fact, a lot of people kind of dismiss it, but sometimes it does. And it's not, and you're more likely to have that moment in an art gallery rather than watching Celebrity Chef or something, you know. So, and it's these moments that give you agency to go out and act. And it is people like us that need to make these decisions about what we do with the reef. I mean, the reef needs a lot of money. And today I read in The Guardian that the 440 million has been taken away. And that's just a political craziness. So it's people like us that have the power to change things, and it's people like us that need to be involved in these decisions. And like I'm really like I studied economics before I went into the art world, so I'm really suspicious of
economic rationalism?
Anything to do with authority. So I think, and that's, I think, yeah, personal level, absolutely. But we need big for reef. Big ideas.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you mentioned the reef a couple of times, and in fact, one of the projects that is aligned with our program is a project to look at engineering the endosymbionts that live inside the reef, to try to get them. So what happens is they get stressed, and they accumulate these things called reactive oxygen species, which are just as bad as they sound, but sometimes they're good because, you know, biology's like that. Often they're good, actually. And they hit a threshold and they can't cope with this and they get expelled. And if you could engineer them to better cope with those reactive oxygen species, then perhaps they wouldn't get expelled. So this is one of the projects that we're looking at. We're a long way from it. We need to identify the genes, we need to look at all the possibilities, and we also need to examine, you know, what might happen on the broader ecological scale. But if we don't start doing that now, there will be no reef. And 50% of our fisheries across the whole globe rely on coral reefs. So are we prepared to not have fisheries going forward into the future? Will have this very, very severe impact on our ability to have fisheries, among many, many other very important roles of our coral reefs. And when I have a sister who lives on a community down just the side of the border with, I'm in Melbourne, northern New South Wales, southern Queensland area. And I kind of go down there and bounce ideas off them when I want to get challenged and when I want to be outside of my comfort zone, my lab zone. And I said, guys, you know, how would you feel about that if you were presented with the opportunity of having either no reefs or genetically engineered reefs? And they're kind of, you know, moderate left wings, I guess. And they were like, yeah, we'll keep the reefs, thanks. You know, it's okay if the GMO, if we don't have any reefs, is worse. So I don't expect everybody to have that response, but these are big questions and they're beyond individual people and beyond individual responses. But the problem is that the people who are making the decisions about them are making decisions based on their individual motivations and their individual responses a lot of the time. Not always, but a lot of the time. So it's I think it's hard for us to step out of our personal individual space, but absolutely critical, because we don't make the right decisions if we're making them on our own behalf most of the time. If we need to be able to be making these decisions on behalf of our future generations, our children and our children's children who have to live in this world.
Yes, and polyps don't have faces. They have little mouths, but that's about it. And they barely have they don't have brains. So it's hard to identify with them and to sort of say, well, we actually need to help them, not because we have a $6 billion a year tourist industry or because of all these fisheries that need the fish, but actually because they are valuable and they have a right to be here for their own sake. And yeah, the more that we all say this, perhaps the more resources we can push towards them. Yeah, and that question, do we want something that's natural or artificial? It's crucial. I don't know what the answer is, and every situation will be different, but it seems to be a very important question, and it seems to be occurring on so many levels in our bodies, in our environment. It's a big one. Mm.
So I see Astrid's got a hand up.
Thank you both. I have a question about the modes of helping these zooantennas, I believe they are called, the little dinoflagellates within the corals. So I would never argue that we should not intervene in something pristine nature. I don't believe pristine nature exists. However, a certain mode of engineering really scares me, because I wonder if we actually have so much wisdom and control to modify these organisms that are billions of years old and have acquired some kind of knowledge that scientists may maybe never fully understand how this particular symbiosis works. Maybe we do. And yeah, so what can you say to make me feel less uncomfortable about this engineering? I guess that's my question.
Science can't make any guarantees. Nothing in life can make any guarantees as much as we would like for it to be able to do that. All we can do is examine it from as many different angles as possible and look at the risk and benefit analysis and say, well, what are the risks and what are the benefits? And we're fortunate in that we've got all these different environments that aren't complete release that we can test these things in. We have very contained lab environments that we can do a lot of testing in. But you won't know until it gets out there into the environment. And we have examples of places where it didn't work, where cane toads were brought in and it went wrong. But we have examples of places where it did work. So we have a cactoblastis moth, which really was, if the cacti had kept marching across the country, it would be a very different country than the one that we recognise today. So I don't know if I can say anything that can completely alleviate your fears. This is a precautionary principle which you're talking about, and I think that it's a natural human thing to be concerned and to be worried. It's an evolved thing. It's important. It's an evolved thing to feel empathy for things that look like you, and that's why we have racism and all sorts of other ugly things. But at the end of the day, at some stage, you need to say, well, we have tools and technologies at our our capability. We have a capability to try something to stop disastrous things happening. Perhaps that's actually our responsibility to try.
Right here in front. Actually, you had your hand up first, and then right in the front. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, I want to say thanks to both of you. All three of you. It's been a great conversation. My question is primarily for Patricia. It's about beauty and its relationship to empathy. And I think that one of the things that I love most in your work is that it seems to straddle this idea of ugliness or revulsion and beauty and empathy at the same time. And I think that particularly in the visuality of our culture at the moment, that your work is political in the sense that it doesn't have to humanize the creatures that you make to make a comment on beauty kind of breeding empathy, I think, for me when I look at it. And I love being in a gallery and people are looking at the work and kind of struggling with that notion that it's really disgusting and amazingly beautiful, and you can almost see them going like, oh, you know. And so, I mean, performance scholars have written a lot about the political and activist power of beauty, and I wondered if you could talk about that in your work.
Yes, well, I'm interested in the idea that, I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to whiz through here. I'm sorry, this must be a bit annoying, but I'll leave it here. I'm interested in the idea that medicine can have a very homogenizing effect on us. That does make me a bit anxious. And we can see that already through cosmetic surgery and so on. And yeah, of course, I'm interested in the idea that we'll be able to change our unborn children so that we can nominate what they're going to be like, and that will minimise difference in our society. That makes me anxious as well. Yeah. But at the same time, I was a mother quite late in life, and I had all the tests. I had them all. So, you know, there's no right or wrong. But I'm really happy to be in this conversation with people. I think it has to be had, and I don't think that of many places that is being had. So one of the ways that I work with my work is, I'm just going to have to go through this. I'm sorry, but when I make a work which this one. So what I try and do with the work is I try and engage the viewer's empathy, and the viewer's empathetic imagination is so powerful. Not my imagination, their imagination. That's really strong. And once that's engaged, and I do that in a way that I try and make the work as kind of interesting and alluring as possible. And often it's quite infantile as well, because infants bring out the best in us. We want to nurture them. And so I purposefully put that into the work. And I also purposefully put a kind of something that's not normal or natural in the work as well, so that it pushes you away. So you're pulled in and pushed away, as you described. And I'm glad you said it, because that's what I hope happens.
But it could be much more scarier than it is.
That's right, and that's Hollywood.
It's tender.
Yes, it is. It is tender, and there's a lot of warmth, tenderness towards these lives, these monsters, but they're not pitiful. They have a lot of integrity and beauty. And it's this space that opens up when you're pulled in and pushed away that leaves the viewer with the opportunity to actually determine for themselves what they think and feel. And that's kind of rare, because we're always told that Kim Kardashian is so beautiful. Like, I've actually come to believe it. Like, honest, and she's crazy looking.
I don't believe it.
I mean,
I don't.
And she's not normal.
No.
And so you're always told what's good, what's beautiful. And I hope in my work, there's space enough to be able to determine your own relationship to something that's not natural. And in the work, it's not just about beauty. It is my husband often says that these creatures are creatures that only a mother could love. Like, you have this sort of maternal relationship to them. But say with these guys, this is a very paternal relationship. They're like those leafy sea dragons, you know, those guys that look like reeds and they have their kids in their mouths, and they're the males that look after the babies. They're like that, and their bodies have kind of blended into these, like into this, the function of husbanding these eggs, and these boots have become part of their body. These beautiful ornate boots extend into the morphology, the functioning of their body to husband these eggs. And these heads are from Charles Le Brun. So Charles Le Brun, I might even have a picture. Charles Le Brun, I'm going to hold it up. I know it's a bit daggy, but Charles Le Brun was a 17th century illustrator, and he did these incredibly popular illustrations of how they understood the body. So if you looked like an owl, you were wise. That was the science. If you looked like a pig, you were greedy. You know, if you looked like a camel, you were asinine. So that was the science. Today, the science is if you have this gene, you have this potential for this disease. You know, it's just a different way of understanding the agency of the body. And so these guys, they have these eagle heads from Charles Le Brun. I mean, it's complete reference to him. And I guess they're just talking about kind of what that ultimate question. You know, what animates us? You know, what is it that keeps us going forward and gives meaning to life and our connections to each other and to our planet.
So you had a question as well.
This is for all of you, I guess. If your interest is in why we change nature and the different ways nature is changed, what is your stance on people who choose to change nature in their decision to be child-free? On the concept of mothers, if we choose to defy what is largely known as biological nature in our ability to reproduce, how do you think the idea of mother can exist outside of blood relationships?
So I think mothers can exist outside of blood relationships all the time, and I think they do, you know. That happens a lot. I mean, children are adopted all the time outside of a blood relationship, and there are maternal relationships that happen between people and their work and things that they create all the time. This report that was just released by the Australian Council of Learned Academies feels like my third child because I lost so much sleep over it, you know. And it feels like it's totally something that I created, you know, with the other members of the expert working group and this report on synthetic biology. But I think that exists. I think it's not so much the maternalism you're talking about, but maybe it's biological determinism or something like that, right? It's the female has evolved to be the bearer of children, and this is a totally existentialist thing. I'm absolutely unqualified to comment on it, I guess. But Patricia, maybe you've got something more intelligent to say.
And maybe I could bring it in relation to the Mothers, Others, and Future Human show that's next door. Could you talk about sort of motherhood or relations of care across species lines?
Yes, and to answer your first part of your question, I think it's completely a great idea if you don't want to bear children that you should be able to. Is that the question? That you should be able to stop that from happening? Is that what your question was?
Interested in, were you talking about only a mother could, I'm a bit nervous, but in the way that you spoke about this artwork and that only a mother could, what did you say? Love.
Oh, yeah, that's my husband's thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, it's a bit of a joke because it's a bit of a joke at my expense. But what I mean by that, I think that I often try and attract a kind of nurturing response. And that's kind of a rare thing in life, I think. Like in our everyday lives, you're not nurturing to people aren't nurturing towards each other. So, and especially in the art world, like, you know, and sort of an art, and there's lots of art that's not about stuff like, it's mostly art, it's not about that kind of stuff. It's about more formal things, and so it's unusual, these kind of ideas in the art world.
So do you see your practice and the characters that you make as kind of your children in a way?
Well, I have children, so they're not my literal children, but they're definitely my progeny, and in some way, and I deeply care about them. So when I get reviews and people say it's just a freak show, I'm incredibly upset by it, because, like, nobody wants to be told that their offspring or just what they create is a freak show. So yeah, I'm not out there with making ironic work, and if you don't get it, that's your problem. You know, you loser. You know, so I'm not like that. No, I deeply want people to connect with the work, and it disappoints me when they don't, and it happens a lot. But you know, that's what happens when you make work that's sincere, and I do care about. The work is actually about nature. You know, we were talking about how nature's inspiring, and it inspires me. And yeah, I'm constantly inspired by nature, and I don't think you need to be a mother to relate to this work. And but I think a nurturing relationship with our planet is probably a place where we could go. Like, I think perhaps it's not great to think that we can keep on taking. And that's an assumption that has to be really changed.
Do you think we can keep producing?
Producing, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of birth in my work. I think any kind of birth is a hopeful, like, it just represents potential. So it's always a kind of hopeful thing. I think we can, and I think we will. I can't stop science. I don't want to. And also, production is actually, interestingly, a very female thing. Like, it is.
So I actually see another question back there.
Hi, thanks very much for this stimulating conversation. Just kind of in response to this last exchange just now, and the desire, the urgency maybe with which, Patricia, you're inviting an audience to connect with the work, to empathize, to look at, to stay with the revulsion, right? Just wondering, in relation to both of your work, there's an urgency to do that is coming across, an urgency to act. I'm wondering, is there a place for turning away in what you do as well, in your practice? We think about artists that go through drafts, discard them. And you mentioned Frankenstein and a scene of utter violence when Frankenstein gives in to the monster's request to create something, right? Should, if we're going to speculate here about normative kind of claims, should the scientist not have heeded that request? Should the scientist have turned away from that request and responded in a different way, right? If the violence was to ensue. So I'm just wondering how you might think about not empathizing, not connecting, hearing revulsion and turning away, and perhaps revealing some of the insides of the machinery of when an idea doesn't reach an audience, a show, a demonstration, a screen might be one way. You've been clicking through the screen show in a way that has made it difficult for us to stay with one image. That might be one technique that comes to mind.
I was just going to say that's very hard to respond to, since the art has been created in order to engage individuals and people and cultures. So responding in a context where the background assumption is that you don't respond, you don't engage, you turn away, might be a very challenging thing. Patricia?
Yeah, it is challenging, and it's quite, I've never had that question. And I know that when people don't engage with me, I get really traumatised by it. So it doesn't feel good. It feels bad. So I don't want to be that person.
So we're running out of time. I see 2 hands up. Maybe we'll take both the questions and then, 3 hands up. All right, so let's do the questions really quickly, and we might have time for a response.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Wonderful conversation. I'm just really curious about not so much a scientist perspective on how nature culture gets divided in a dichotomy, but I'm interested, Patricia, maybe that you often talk about nature as it exists out there, and rather than creating a more flat ontology where we might talk about nature cultures where it is this entangled sense that we're, not just in a binary with nature. So I'm just curious how you might talk about that, because you tend to talk about nature as an object outside of, outside of your humanness or your human production.
So that's 1. I think 2 is right there.
Oh, shall I ask? Yeah, so you just mentioned about engaging the audience, and it reminds me of another work that I saw in GOMA, which is actually a short video of a little girl lying, taking a nap, and then these little creatures approaching her. So what I'm trying to ask is the 2 forms of expression, art installation, still installation, and also moving installations. Do you find, how do they differ, and do they actually engage in the audience in different ways? Yeah.
All of a sudden a lot on the table, but let's take one more in the back.
Okay, I regret asking this after that, being tabled up, but thank you so much for this really surreal and interesting conversation. In reference to this conversation, because the word science was used quite a bit, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what is science to you, and what qualifies, I mean, if it is something that is a practice or a material, what qualifies in becoming that material or practice?
So we've got about 5 minutes left, so if you want to respond to all those questions on the table, leave them hanging.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I didn't think I think you brought up a very interesting idea. I didn't think that I was creating an impression that nature's over here and we're over here. I'm actually arguing for something that's completely blended. That we are not we don't. I'm hoping that the barriers will come down when I show this world that's completely commingled and presents this situation where you can literally see how it might be. And so I'm actually hoping for the opposite. I don't see it as other at all. And in fact, otherness is something that I'm hoping to really. I'm interested in our relationship to the idea of the other by showing these different creatures and engaging that response. So no, I don't feel that think nature's over there. I know that if I want to see a bird of prey, I just have to go into the centre of the city. I don't have to go into the forest. I know that I live with nature in my house. We have mice. My studio's got birds in it. We've got. I live with nature, or everything that's growing is natural, or I don't know, nature. Well, yeah, we probably need another term. You're right. We probably need something that's not so binary, something else. Someone's got to do that. Yeah.
do you have any concluding thoughts?
So science, to me, this is an easy question for me to answer, so I'm grabbing the easy one. So science is like a really visceral part of me. It's kind of like the reason I exist. And the thing about science is that it's the area of research that you can be in where you can create new knowledge. And every now and then you do your little set of experiments and it works for once instead of not working. And you have this new knowledge that is a gift for the rest of humanity to have forevermore. And you create that. It's a creative process. And for a little while, you're the only person who has that knowledge ever in history, and it's really, really special. And then you get to go out and tell everybody about it and be excited and bring them along in your excitement as you tell them the story of this piece of knowledge that you've created. And for me, that's what science is. It's the act of creating new knowledge and gifting that to humanity forevermore.
So in an hour and a half in this same room, Karen Barada is giving a lecture, and she's already come up with an idiom for thinking about post-natural and post-human ethics. So stay tuned. We all have to leave this room. And the boot flower, Google Maps says 5 minutes. I timed it, it's actually 3 minutes. So don't go around. So you basically go out here, there's a big round building, go around behind it, past the sheep. There's sheep on your left. Go upstairs, downstairs, and there's a gate right as you get down the stairs. So at testing grounds, there is the boot flower. There's also a lovely set of other collected artworks. This is a collaboration between the Laboratory of Aesthetics and Ecology, 2 colleagues here from Europe. J.J. Hastings played a big role in this exhibit as well. In the next 15 minutes, there'll also be a performance by Yvette Watt called Luck of the Draw. It's an Anthropocene game where humans are wild cards or jokers. So you'll have the opportunity to engage with images of animals that have been declared pests or vermin, an interesting maybe counterpoint to some of the things that we were talking about with relation to gene drive. So thank you both for this lively, generative, smart, unexpected conversation that explored lots of themes related to the Anthropocene. So please join me, give a round of applause for Claudia.